On the morning of March 17, 1945, near the shattered town of Remagen, a single German pillbox had already stopped an American advance cold. It had killed men, broken assaults, and turned every standard tactic into a death sentence. Staff Sergeant James McCord, just 23 years old. What he carried wasn't supposed to exist. Strapped to his shoulder was something that looked like an M1 Garand. Until it didn't, bolted to the rifle was a crude metal nozzle connected to fuel tanks and wires, a weapon that could fire bullets one moment and release fire the next. The Army called it the M1A1 rifle flamethrower. German soldiers would give it a different name, Devil's Breath. Unlike traditional flamethrowers, this weapon didn't mark its operator as a target. The man carrying it looked like any other infantryman. That was the horror. In close-range combat, McCord could step forward and unleash a burst of fire reaching nearly 30 feet, hot enough to flood bunkers, cellars, and concrete pillboxes with flame and suffocating heat. Positions that had held for hours collapsed in seconds. The effect wasn't just physical. German weapon. By the time they realized what they were facing, fire was already pouring inside. Standard assaults had produced staggering casualties. This weapon changed the equation, but it came at a cost. The M1A1 was heavy, unstable, and unforgiving. It had to be used at dangerously close range. Cold weather interfered with ignition. Only 43 of these weapons ever reached fighting units. The men who carried them weren't specialists. They were ordinary riflemen forced to wield something extraordinary. This is not a story about technology alone. It's the story of desperation, fear, and a weapon so effective that it unsettled even the army that built it. For a brief moment in World War II, fire became something any soldier could carry, and it changed how urban combat was fought forever. On the morning of March 17, 1945, the American advance near Remagen wasn't stalled because of poor planning or lack of fire. It was stalled because of a single position. A German pillbox dug into the edge of the town, low profile. Reinforced concrete, carefully placed to dominate open ground. No towering walls, no obvious artillery emplacements. But it was lethal. By sunrise, 11 American soldiers were already dead, not wounded. Dead. Every attempt to approach it ended the same way. Men ran, men fell, and the machine gun inside never stopped. The Finnick, not desperation, precision. Whoever was inside knew exactly what they were doing. Grenades were tried first. They bounced off the concrete or detonated harmlessly outside the firing slit. Bazookas followed. The rockets left black scorch marks on the face of the bunker, nothing more. The walls were too thick, the angle was wrong, and every second spent outside cover. Galling artillery would have solved the problem, but artillery wasn't an option. Behind the stalled infantry lay the Remagen Bridge, the last intact crossing over the Rhine, destroying the pillbox with heavy fire. Risk damaging the bridge itself, so the company stayed pinned, and the casualty count kept rising. By early 1945, American infantry units across Germany were facing the same nightmare again and again. Not massive fortresses like those along the Atlantic coast. Those had been crushed months earlier. These were smaller positions, harder to detect, harder to suppress. Reinforced houses turned into firing points. Cellars converted into kill zones. Each one was capable of stopping an entire company. Standard infantry doctrine demanded aggressive movement, close the distance, throw grenades, rush the position on paper. It worked in reality. It was a slaughter. Attacking a fortified position with rifles and grenades often resulted in catastrophic losses. Even when successful units could expect to lose a third or more of their men in the process. Tank support helped, but tanks were not a solution everywhere. Urban rubble trapped them, narrow streets exposed them, and after the Battle of the Bulge, armored units were stretched thin, something they could carry themselves. Something that didn't require calling in artillery, something that could reach inside concrete. They already had flamethrowers, and everyone hated them. Devastating weapons. When they worked, they ended fights quickly. Defenders abandoned positions, or died where they stood. But they came with a brutal trade-off of fully loaded rounds. The operator couldn't carry a rifle, couldn't fight beyond short range, and was instantly recognizable. German units learn it fast. If a flamethrower appeared on the battlefield, every gun targeted the man carrying it. When a flamethrower operator was hit, the result was often canistrata, and morale collapsed. By late 1944, many units actively avoided using flamethrowers at all. Some commanders refused to deploy them, not because they were ineffective, but because watching men burn alive destroyed cohesion faster than enemy fire. The army faced a contradiction it couldn't ignore. Flame weapons worked. What infantry needed was something radically different. A weapon that delivered fire without announcing itself. A weapon that didn't turn its operator into a walking target. A weapon that allowed a soldier to remain a rifleman first. And something far more dangerous, second manuals or long-term planning. It came from desperation. In late 1944, engineers were given a blunt directive: put flame capability on the M1 Garand, not replace the rifle, not create a new specialist weapon, attach it. The constraints were brutal. It had to be light enough that a soldier could still move and aim, simple enough to function in combat conditions, and effective enough to justify the risk of using it at close range. There was no time for perfection. Prototypes were rushed. Testing was limited. Field manuals barely existed. By early 1945, a handful of experimental units were produced and quietly shipped to Europe. That was the weapon now strapped to Staff Sergeant James McCord's shoulder. It looked wrong: a crude metal nozzle clamped near the rifle's barrel, wires running to a small ignition system, fuel bottles hanging from his gear slamming against his ribs as he moved. It added more than 20 pounds to a rifle already considered heavy. More importantly, it forced its operator into the most dangerous space on the battlefield. Effective range wasn't measured in hundreds of meters. It wasn't even measured in dozens. To work properly, the weapon required McCord to get close enough to see movement inside the bunker, close enough to hear voices, close enough that if anything went wrong, if the ignition failed, if the pressure dropped, if the fuel didn't vaporize correctly, he would die before anyone could reach him. McCord knew all of this. He also knew something else. Every standard approach had already failed. More men would die if nothing changed. The pillbox wasn't going to stop firing on its own. The signal came down the line. McCord rose from cover and began moving forward, zigzagging as he'd been trained with each step. He carried something no infantryman was ever meant to carry: the ability to turn a normal rifle into fire. And within moments, the battlefield around Remagen would learn exactly what that meant. The M1 rifle flamethrower was never meant to be elegant. Even the engineers who built it didn't pretend otherwise. It was a compromise stacked on top of compromises, designed under pressure, tested in haste, and shipped to war before anyone truly understood what it would do to the men forced to use it. On paper, the concept made sense: a standard infantry rifle, a detachable flame system, 2 weapons in one. In reality, the system balanced on the edge of failure. The additional weight alone changed how the M1 Garand behaved. By rifle standards, the Garand became awkward, with another 22 pounds attached. The center of gravity shifted forward. Aiming felt slower. Recoil-stressed mounting points never designed to absorb that kind of force. Every burst of rifle fire loosened the brackets holding the nozzle in place, and the flame system itself was unforgiving. Fuel had to be pressurized just right. Too much and the lines could rupture. Ignition relied on a small electrical system: battery pack, wiring, ignition coil, all exposed to mud, rain, cold, and shock. In laboratory conditions, it worked reliable. On a battlefield in March, it was another matter entirely. Cold weather slowed ignition. Moisture shorted connections. Operator quickly learned that the M1A1 was not a weapon you could simply trust. It had to be tested constantly before every movement, before every engagement. A single missed check could be fatal. The psychological burden on the men assigned to carry it was immediate. Unlike flamethrower operators, they weren't trained specialists. They were riflemen, men who expected to fight at distance, to move with their squad, to rely on cover and suppressive fire. The M1A1 demanded something else. It demanded proximity. To use it effectively, a soldier had to close to within 30 feet, often less. Close enough that every sound inside a bunker was audible. Close enough that hesitation meant death. And once the flame was used, there was no hiding. The roar of ignition was unmistakable, a sharp, violent sound that echoed through streets and alleyways. Every enemy within hundreds of yards knew exactly where it came from. The weapon solved one problem and created another. German units adapted quickly. Even without knowing exactly what the weapon was, they understood the threat. Infantry fire concentrated on anyone suspected of carrying it. Snipers watched for unusual movement closer than anyone else dared. Using the M1A1 meant stepping into the most dangerous role in the unit. And sometimes the weapon betrayed its operator outright. Early field reports describe ignition failures at the worst possible moments. Fuel sprayed without igniting, pressure dropped mid-burst, electrical systems failed after repeated recoil. One operator reported pressing the ignition button, counting seconds in his head, pulling the trigger and watching nothing happen while bullets tore apart the cover in front of him. In several cases, operators were wounded or killed before they could disengage. Others survived by seconds. The M1I1 was effective, but it was not forgiving. Despite this, demand for the weapon spread rapidly. The reason was simple. When it worked too well in controlled engagements. Defenders abandoned fortified positions within seconds of flame contact. In enclosed spaces, heat and oxygen depletion incapacitated men who were never directly burned. Units using the M1A1 cleared positions faster. They suffered fewer casualties. They avoided the deadly bottleneck of doorways and stairwells. Word traveled through command channels faster than the supply system could keep up. Requests flooded in. Battalion commanders asked for the weapon by name. Others requested priority shipment, knowing they might only receive one unit per platoon. But production couldn't meet demand. The weapon's components were specialized. Ignition coils require precision manufacturing. Nozzle assembly 45, fewer than 100 units existed in total. Fewer still made it into the hands of infantry and infantry. The rest sat in depots, unused not because they weren't wanted, but because no training doctrine existed. No one had planned for success. The Army had expected the M1A1 to be a stopgap experiment, a niche solution, something used sparingly if at all. Instead, it became indispensable overnight. 3-hour crash courses, attach the nozzle, check the lines, test ignition, engage targets at close range. That was it. No tactical manuals, no standardized procedures, no integration into existing squad doctrine. Operators learned it through experience or didn't survive long enough to learn it all. The men selected to carry the weapon shared common traits. They were older than average, more experienced, less likely to panic. A man carrying the M1A1 had to commit fully or not at all. Half measures got people killed in urban combat. The weapon found its true purpose. Buildings turned into fortresses. Basements became kill zones. Window room clearing tactics were suicidal under these conditions. A single defender with a submachine gun could hold a stairwell against multiple attackers. The M1I1 changed that dynamic completely. Operators could approach from outside, engage with rifle fire, then switch to flame without ever crossing the threshold. Fire flowed through windows, down stairwells, into basements. Defenders fled or died without forcing attackers into confined spaces. After-action reports began to repeat the same phrases: did not enter structure, enemy evacuated position, 0 friendly casualties. But the weapon's effectiveness came with a darker cost. Operators reported difficulty sleeping. They described the sound of ignition echoing in their heads. They remembered the screams. The smell lingered long after engagements ended, burning fuel, scorched fabric. Some soldiers refused to fight near M1A1. Operators, afraid of friendly fire or retaliatory strikes. Others avoided them altogether, uneasy with what the weapon represented. The operators themselves carried a heavier burden. They knew how the enemy died. They knew it wasn't quick. Some requested reassignment after only a few missions. Others hardened themselves, treating the weapon as nothing more than a tool, an equation of survival, fire or die. The German response evolved as well. Captured training materials show that by late April, German infantry units were warned about rifle-mounted flame weapons. Guidance instructed immediate engagement of all infantry at close range, recognizing that operators were indistinguishable from regular riflemen. But knowing didn't equal surviving. By the time defenders recognized what they were facing, the weapon had already done its work. Statistical summaries, compiled in April 1945, showed a clear pattern. Infantry units supported by M1 Garand operators experienced significantly fewer casualties when reducing fortified positions. Calendar rates increased. The weapon was reshaping infantry combat in real time, and it was doing so without anyone fully understanding the long-term consequences. The men carrying it walked a narrow line between survival and catastrophe, relying on a system that could save their squad or kill them outright. For Staff Sergeant James McCord and the others like him, the decision was simple. Every position cleared with fire was one less doorway their Brabant stayed, and the next engagement would prove just how high that cost could be. Staff Sergeant James McCord didn't move right away. He stayed pressed against the wrecked half-track, breathing through his nose, counting the seconds between machine gun bursts. Dirt and metal fragments jumped around him every time the gun fired. The sound was no longer shocking. It had become rhythmic, predictable. That was the most dangerous part. The distance to the pillbox was short enough now that McCord could hear voices inside, not shouting, not panic, casual conversation. The calm confidence of soldiers who believed they were untouchable. They had reason to believe that everything else had already failed. McCord shifted his weight. The fuel tank slammed lightly against his ribs. He felt the added mass pulling his shoulder forward, throwing off his balance. He adjusted the sling, trying to settle the weapon without exposing himself. This was the moment the M1 Garand demanded. There would be no retreat once he committed. He reached for the secondary ignition button mounted near the rifle's safety. His thumb hovered there longer than it should have, not because he was afraid to use it, but because he knew what hesitation meant. One of the men in his squad broke cover and sprinted forward, trying to draw fire. The machine gun cut him down in less than 5 steps. McCord saw him fall, saw him try to crawl, saw him stop moving. The rhythm of the gun didn't change. McCord pressed the ignition button. Nothing happened. He held it down longer. The system was supposed to heat the ignition coil, bring it up to temperature, prepare it to ignite the vaporized fuel. In testing, it took less than a second. This wasn't testing. Cold air bit through his gloves. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The weapon had been tested in warmer conditions. McCord counted in his head 1 second, 2. He released the button and pulled the trigger. Nothing. The weapon stayed silent. For a split second, the realization hit him harder than fear. If the system didn't ignite, he was holding 22 pounds of dead weight right in front of a functioning machine gun. He ducked lower as bullets tore chunks from the half-track's armor. Metal screamed. Sparks flew inches from his face. McCord pressed the button again. This time he held it longer. 3 seconds, 4. The machine gun adjusted its aim. Dirt erupted closer now. The gunner inside the pillbox had noticed him. McCord released the button and squeezed the trigger again. The world exploded into sound and light. Flame erupted from the nozzle in a violent, continuous stream, orange and yellow with a blue core. The roar was deafening, like dozens of blowtorches igniting at once. Heat washed over McCord's hands and face, even from behind the weapon. He didn't stop to admire it. He adjusted his aim instinctively, sweeping the flame across the face of the pillbox, walking it toward the firing slit. The stream struck concrete first, splashing fire across the surface, then found the opening. Fire poured inside. The machine gun stopped, not gradually, instantly. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then came the screaming, high-pitched, uncontrolled, the kind of sound that didn't belong to trained soldiers. The pillbox door burst open. 2 German soldiers stumbled out, uniforms burning, hands clawing at their faces. One collapsed after a few steps. The other made it slightly farther before falling forward and not getting back up. McCord released the trigger. The flame cut off. The entire burst had lasted less than 4 seconds, less than a tenth of his total fuel supply. The pillbox responsible for killing 11 men was silent. The squad didn't rush forward immediately. They waited, weapons trained, expecting the gun to resume firing. It didn't. When they entered the bunker, they found more bodies inside. Some burned, others not. Men who had suffocated as the flame consumed the oxygen in the enclosed space, their lungs filled with superheated air. McCord stood at the entrance staring at the nozzle still glowing faintly red. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollow. There was no time to process what had just happened. 6 more fortified positions lay between them and the bridge. McCord checked the fuel gauge, nearly 90% remaining. The company commander changed tactics immediately. No more frontal assaults, no more grenade rushes. McCord and 2 other M1A1 operators were pulled forward and assigned as the spearhead. They moved from position to position, supported by rifle fire, advancing methodically. Approach, under cover. Suppress, with rifle fire. Switch to flame. Each time the effect was the same. Defenders fled or died. Positions collapsed. Resistance evaporated. By early afternoon, the difference was undeniable. Before the M1I1 had been used, the company had suffered more than 40 casualties in a matter of hours, with little progress to show for it. After the first successful engagement, casualty rates dropped sharply. By midday, 17 fortified positions had been cleared. Only 11 men were wounded, none were killed. The contrast was so stark it bordered on disbelief. Word spread quickly. Reports were sent up the chain of command describing a weapon that allowed infantry to reduce fortified positions. Commanders who had spent months watching men die at doorways suddenly saw an alternative. Requests flooded in, and units begged for the M1A1, offered to trade ammunition, offered to share artillery allocations. The weapon was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. But solutions in war never remain uncontested. Captured documents and interrogations revealed that defenders were being warned about a new American weapon. Infantry units were instructed to treat all advancing riflemen as potential flame operators. Fire discipline tightened. It didn't matter. The weapon's greatest strength wasn't its flame, it was confusion. There was no distinctive silhouette. No bulky tanks on a soldier's back. No warning. By the time fire appeared, the engagement was already over. The psychological impact extended beyond individual positions. German surrender rates increased dramatically in areas where the weapon had been used. Fire didn't just kill. It broke will for McCord and the other operators. The cost continued to rise. Each use of the weapon drew more attention. Each engagement made them a higher priority target. Sleep became difficult. Hands shook when the weapon wasn't in use. The sound of ignition echoed in their heads long after fighting stopped. Some men asked to be reassigned, others refused. They knew what the alternative looked like: doorways, stairwells, bodies stacked in narrow corridors. Fire was worse, but fire kept their brothers alive. By the end of the day, the American advance resumed. The Remagen bridge remained intact. The pillboxes that had once dominated the approach were nothing more than blackened concrete and silence. For a brief window in March 1945, the M1A1 rifle flamethrower had done exactly what it was designed to do. It gave infantry fire they could carry, and it did so at a cost that no one engineer, commander, or politician was fully prepared to confront, because once fire entered the hands of ordinary riflemen, it could never truly be taken back. The success at Remagen didn't stay local for long. Within 48 hours after action, reports moved up the chain of command. They were brief, factual, and unusually direct. Fortified positions neutralized without entry adequately shortened. Commanders didn't need elaborate explanations. They understood the implications immediately. For months, urban combat in Germany had followed a predictable pattern. Infantry advanced, defenders waited, doorways turned into kill zones, stairwells became graves. Every fortified building demanded blood before it surrendered ground. Now that pattern had been broken. Units that had struggled for hours, not because the enemy had grown weaker, but because the method had changed. The M1I1 didn't replace rifles, grenades, or tanks. It replaced hesitation with flame available at close range. Infantry no longer had to gamble their lives on entering confined spaces. They could apply pressure from outside. They could deny defenders the one advantage fortifications had always provided: protection. Statistic compiled in late March and early April reflected the shift. Infantry units supported by rifle-mounted flame weapons experienced nearly in half German surrender rates. It was happening in real time. Requests for the weapon multiplied. Platoon leaders asked for one, company commanders wanted 2, battalion staff argued over allocation. Knowing full well that supply couldn't keep up, the problem wasn't demand. It was preparation. The Army had never expected the M1A1 to work this well. No manuals outlined proper integration. There were no standardized tactics for coordinating rifle fire with flame bursts. Operators relied on instinct, experience, and learn. Emergency training programs sprang up almost overnight. They were brutally simple. Attach the nozzle, check the fuel lines, test ignition. Engage targets at close range. No discussion of psychology, no guidance on after effects, no consideration for what carrying such a weapon would do to the men assigned to it. The assumption was clear. War didn't wait. German forces, as always, adapted. By late April, intelligence reports indicated that defenders were being warned about a new American capability. Captured documents described a rifle-mounted flame device with an effective range of roughly 30 feet. More importantly, the documents noted that operators were indistinguishable from regular infantry. This changed German defensive behavior. Advancing infantry earlier, at closer ranges, snipers were told to watch for soldiers moving aggressively toward fortified positions. In some areas, defenders attempted to withdraw preemptively rather than face flame at close quarters. It didn't always help. The fundamental problem remained the same. There was no way to reliably identify who carried the weapon until it was already in use. By the time defender realized what they were facing, adaptation reduced effectiveness slightly. It did not negate it. The weapon's psychological impact continued to ripple outward. Prisoners captured after M1A1 engagements reported the same reaction again and again. Confusion, shock, a sense that the rules had changed without warning. They described seeing what appeared to be ordinary riflemen advance, then watching flame erupt from a weapon that shouldn't have been able to do that. The fear wasn't just of burning, it was of unpredictability, and unpredictability erodes discipline faster than casualties ever could. For the men carrying the weapon, they were not shielded from the consequences of what they were doing. The sound of ignition became familiar, too familiar. Operators tried recognizing it instantly, even amid heavy fire. A sharp, violent roar that cut through the chaos of battle. The smell lingered, burned fuel, heated concrete, fabric. Some operators reported that those sounds followed them long after engagements ended. Others spoke of a numbness setting in, a deliberate emotional shutdown that allowed them to continue functioning. Not everyone could manage it. Some requested reassignment after only a few missions. Others avoided using the flame unless absent otherwise. There were also practical dangers. Fuel mixtures varied widely depending on supply availability. Incorrect ratios resulted in poor ignition or unstable burns. In several early incidents, operators were injured when fuel ignited prematurely or failed to ignite at all. Cold weather remained a constant enemy. Electrical ignition systems took longer to heat. Pressure dropped, range shortened. Operators adapted in dangerous ways. Some carried spare batteries wrapped in cloth, others tested ignition obsessively before every movement. At least one resorted to manually igniting the fuel, using a cigarette lighter. When the electrical system failed, an act never intended, never authorized, and barely survived. They were becoming technicians out of necessity. Every engagement added to a growing body of unofficial knowledge: what worked, what didn't, and what would get you killed. The weapon was evolving in the field faster than any engineer could have predicted. So was its reputation. Within weeks, the M1A1 had become something more than a piece of equipment. It became a symbol for American infantry. It represented survival, a way to fight fortified positions without sacrificing entire squads. A method to force the enemy out without charging blindly into prepared fire. For German defenders, it became a warning, not just of fire, but of an enemy willing to close the distance and end the fight without mercy. Commanders began rotating operators to prevent burnout. Fuel became a limiting factor. Training expanded but always lagged behind demand. The Army was playing catch-up with its own invention. By early April, dozens of units across 3rd Army, 7th Army, and 1st Army were using the M1A1 in varying capacities. Urban centers became its primary domain cities where concrete and confined spaces favored flame over fragmentation. In places like Aachen, Cologne, and Nuremberg, after-action reports echoed the same conclusion. The weapon reduced casualties, it shortened engagements, it altered infantry behind, a residue that couldn't be measured in statistics. Operators spoke less. Sleep became fragment memories, resurfaced uninvited. The Army tracked casualties and clearance rates. It did not track the cost of carrying fire. That reckoning would come later. For now, the weapon remained in use not because it was perfect, but because nothing else worked as well. The enemy had learned, adapted, adjusted, and still the flame continued to decide fights. The M1A1 had proven itself on the battlefield. What remained unanswered was whether anyone was prepared to live with what it demanded in return. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the M1A1 didn't receive a parade. There were no headlines celebrating it, no public demonstrations, no training films preserved for future generations. It simply disappeared. Production stopped quietly. Reports were classified. The technology might be useful in future conflicts. Better to restrict access. The real reason was harder to define. The Army didn't know what to do with a weapon that worked this well and left such an uncomfortable trail behind it. Flamethrowers had always been controversial. They were brutal, psychological, devastating, and impossible to son. But they had also been limited. Specialists carried them. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone knew what they represented. The M1A1 erased that boundary. It put fire into the hands of ordinary riflemen. That fact alone changed how people felt about it. For the men who carried it, there was no clean ending. Staff Sergeant James McCord survived the war. He returned home in the summer of 1945 like millions of others, and tried to resume a normal life. He didn't speak publicly about the weapon. He didn't write articles. He didn't lecture on tactics. He went quiet. In a diary entry written weeks after the fighting near Remagen, he noted using the weapon multiple times in a single day. He recorded the number of enemy soldiers killed. Then he stopped writing for several days. When he resumed, the entries were shorter, less detail, less emotion, more silence. Like many operators, McCord understood something that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Fire ended fights quickly, but it stayed with you. The screams, the smell, the way men reacted when flame entered confined spaces, those weren't memories you could easily set aside. Other operators struggled in different ways. Some tried to justify their actions purely in terms of survival. Every position cleared with flame was a position. Their squad didn't have to assault. Every defender killed at a distance was a defender who couldn't kill them. That logic made sense. It didn't erase the images. Others compartmentalized. They treated the weapon as a mechanical solution to a tactical problem. Press button, pull trigger, end threat. It worked until it didn't. Nightmares were common. Sleep was fractured. Some men requested transfers after only a few missions. A few carried the weight for difficulties and effectiveness. By the numbers, the M1A1 was a success. Units supported by it suffered fewer losses. Engagements were shorter. Surrender rates increased. But the numbers didn't capture everything. They didn't track how many operators avoided discussing the war entirely. They didn't record how many marriages were strained by silence. They didn't measure the cost of carrying something that killed in one of the most personal ways possible. After the war, the M1A1 remained classified for more than 2 decades. When it was finally declassified in the late 1960s, it no longer mattered. Military technology had moved on. Flamethrowers were being replaced by incendiary grenades, rockets, and thermobaric weapons, tools that achieved similar effects without the same visual horror. The niche the M1A1 once filled still existed. The weapon itself did not. Of the hundreds produced, only a fraction survived. Others were preserved quietly in warehouses or museums, stripped of fuel, ignition systems disconnected. They looked harmless, just metal wires, a nozzle clamped to a rifle without context. You could walk past one and never know what it had done. The men who carried them knew. They remembered that for a brief moment in the final months of the war, infantry combat changed. not because of overwhelming firepower or a clever maneuver, but because someone decided that closing the distance with fire was better than sacrificing men at doorways. The weapon was born from desperation. It was refined through blood, and it vanished as quietly as it arrived. That silence is part of its legacy. Modern infantry doctrine still reflects the problem. The M1A1 was built to solve fortified positions, enclosed spaces, the deadly geometry of rooms and corridors. Today, different tools are used, different names, different justification. Find a way to end the fight without sending men into a place they won't come out of. In that sense, the M1I1 never really went away. It simply became something else. James McCord lived into old age. When a historian finally tracked him down decades later, he spoke cautiously, not proudly. He described the weapon as effective, then paused. Maybe too effective, he said. He understood what they had done. He understood why they had done it. He also understood why the army chose to forget it. Some weapons don't fit comfortably into peacetime narratives. They raise questions that don't have clean answers. What is acceptable when survival is at stake? How much brutality is justified to save lives on your side? And what happens to the men who carry that burden when the war ends? The M1A1 rifle flamethrower answered one question clearly. It worked. Everything else remains unsettled. The Germans called it devil's breath. American soldiers called it something simpler, fire. And for those who carried it, fire didn't stay on the battlefield. It followed them home.